Chapter 10. The Fall of Singapore, January to March 1942. In the early weeks of 1942, as battle raged in Western Europe and North Africa, the Japanese threat to invade Malaya and Singapore became a reality. It was unthinkable to the British that the island they'd nicknamed the Gibraltar of the East could fall, and yet fall it did with dire and terrible consequences. Some 80,000 prisoners of war were taken in Singapore, 50,000 more in Malaya. No wonder British Prime Minister Churchill described it as the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history. But before the events of 1942 unfolded, the Japanese had had to neutralize the possibility of American intervention. They were thirsty for resources. They had no source of oil to speak of, having lost a shattering 93% of their supply after US President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered an embargo in July 1941. Although the Japanese enjoyed an oil treaty with the Dutch, that too was broken as the Netherlands joined the embargo. Starved of oil, metal, and other resources, Japan could either draw back and lose face or seek to find the resources it needed elsewhere. Those resources lay in the South Pacific. The US Pacific Fleet was the only force capable of challenging Japan's navy. The Americans had bases in the Philippines, which could threaten lines of communication between the Japanese home islands and the East Indies. Every oil tanker heading for Japan would have to pass by American-held Luzon. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force laid waste to much of the American fleet and Air Force stationed at Pearl Harbour. It was a strike of such audacity it almost defied belief. President Roosevelt described it as a date which will live in infamy. No longer could America take an isolationist view. The war could no longer be seen as a purely European conflict. On December 8th, the US Congress had voted that a state of war existed between the United States and Japan. On December 11th, the Axis countries of Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. Congress immediately recognized the existence of a state of war with Germany and Italy. The US was now at war on all fronts. The conflict in the Pacific and the war in Europe had different causes. Part of the reason they became entangled was Adolf Hitler's decision to declare war on America in the hours after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbour. And yet the Japanese had requested no help from him, and even if they had, he had none to offer. There were those in America who did not relish the prospect of fighting in the Pacific and in Europe. And yet Hitler's decision to declare war meant that the world's two greatest military and industrial powers, America and Russia, were now aligned against him. The main cause of war in the Pacific, as we shall see, was Japan's decision to spread its empire further. What Britain had done 100 years before, Japan now sought to copy. For the Japanese, there was no such thing as the Second World War. For them, it was the Greater East Asia War, a conflict that had begun not in 1939, but in 1931 with the invasion of Manchuria. China was the great enemy. With 65 million mouths to feed, Japan's military decided the only way to support the population was expansion. The Japanese had been cruel invaders of China, seeking the glory of empire, but also the wealth that lay beyond her borders in larger markets for her industry. However, the wealth Japan sought to take by invasion belonged at that time to European colonial powers. The French were in Indochina, the Dutch in the East Indies, and Britain in Malaya, Singapore, and Burma. With the colonial powers fighting a war in Europe, their military capabilities were stretched. Japan chose this moment to pounce. But if Japan was to be successful in moving against these old colonial powers, it had to keep the American Pacific Fleet from coming to their aid. The assault on Pearl Harbour gave them the edge they sought. Japan struck hard and fast, attacking American possessions in the Pacific, the Philippines, Wake Island, and Guam. Midway Island was shelled by Japanese warships. It was a pattern to be repeated over and over again. They then moved on mainland Asia. Hong Kong, what the Japanese called the citadel of British imperialism in China, was hit by air and sea. Air
Sample complete. Ready to continue?